the Fair Fight Initiative podcast, brought to you by the Fair Fight Initiative, a nonprofit organization that crowdsources litigation to end mass incarceration. I'm Linda Franks, the Executive Director of the Fair Fight Initiative in Baton Rouge.
And I'm Dave Cartoonan of the Fair Fight Initiative in Boston. In this episode, we're going to be speaking to Bianca Tylek, the founder and executive director of Worth Rises, which focuses on the impact that the for-profit prison industry has on both our communities and on our society. And we'll have an update on how the Fair Fight Initiative has crowdsourced funds to hire a team of attorneys in the disturbing death of Javon Kennerson, yet another death in another for-profit prison operated by LaSalle Corrections.
And we'll share a way that one community is taking action against mass incarceration and ways you can advocate in your own community in our Infinite Hope report. But first, Dave, stop me if you've heard this before. So President Biden is keeping true to his word of making the Supreme Court look more like the actual diverse beauty of the American population.
It only took 250 years.
Right? 200, that's all. By nominating Miss Ketanji Brown Jackson, a beautiful Black woman, judge of the United States of America, has been nominated to the Supreme Court. And you said,
you know what? I hadn't heard that before. That's never happened before.
You
said, stop me if you've heard this before. I sense that something else is coming.
Oh my goodness. You think? So how is it now, right, that over the history of the Supreme Court, we've had people nominated and appointed to this seat who haven't even been lawyers, right? And now all of a sudden, everybody's clamoring for qualifications.
Show me your resume.
Is she qualified?
This can't be real. No, this can't be possible.
And that adage of, I would rather have the most qualified person than just putting someone in a chair for the sake of, because of their color or their gender. I mean, how rich is that?
Yes, because we have such a rich history of doing that, right? This is it's entirely meritocracy for until 1981 that they were all white men, right?
Oh my goodness!
And then there was a woman, and then excuse me, all white men except for Thurgood Marshall. Excuse me,
right?
Little historical, just a little tiny check there.
And I would be disingenuous to say that. This, I mean, in the realm of diversity of American culture and the different population groups that are here, the fact that, and I say this very delicately and with much, much respect, please understand that.
You're not
that of course we've had white men, we've had white women, we've had a Black man, we have had a Hispanic.
Yep.
A lady of Hispanic descent. But I mean, in the realm of it, you would have thought that after the white woman, we would have gotten a Black woman kind of, I mean, like I said, I'm being a little disingenuous here, but it just amazes me that at this time now, the hypocrisy of wanting to ask for these, specific bona fides, she's got to jump through all of these intellectual and moral hoops when that has never been the case before.
And already has. I mean, let's be clear here. She already has jumped through those hoops. You know those videos that show online where they've recreated like the Super Mario Brothers game and like Mario is jumping like over the fireballs and doing all these ridiculous things to try to get through. She has already done that. She is more qualified on paper and has more experience on the bench than the last 4 nominees combined.
Come on now.
Tell
the truth.
Linda.
Tell the truth.
So not only does she have to jump through these hoops now and say, this can't be possible. A Black woman, we set up this whole system so that this wouldn't happen. So this can't be possible, right? She's already done it. And they're still saying, I'm gonna need to see some ID. Right? Not surprising, but also, when you talk about, I like to think of the sort of the matrix of discrimination, right? And in the upper left, you have white males. Mm-hmm. And then to the right, you maybe have white females who are sort of one order of magnitude discriminated on because of their gender. And maybe below the white male, you have the Black male who is discriminated upon because of his race. But 2 orders of magnitude off to that one to the right in the matrix and one below is the Black
Yes.
woman. And
Yes.
I don't need to describe this to you, but tell me what that's like seeing this.
It's about time.
Yeah.
Because when you talk about the American experience and you juxtapose that to the four figures that you just described, the white male, the white female, the Black male, and now the Black female. When I tell you that, and this has been my experience in my America, that women of my race, Black women, have always been a leveler of society. We've always been a nurturer in the homes. We've always been people who bring, what's the word I want to use? Clarity and a sense of getting back to that which is important in our communities. We've always been fighters for everyone, for our children, for others' children, for just the family, for the institutions that we are a part of. And I know that some of my my amazing Black women in society will hold this up, that sometimes we find ourselves as the only double minority in a situation. And we are the go-to person. We are the ones that everyone comes to for advice. We are the ones that kind of quiet down the hush when there is a lot of chaos going on. And I just feel that now that there is a completeness for this jury, for this court, and I am just overwhelmingly proud of Miss Brown Jackson, of course, but I appreciate President Biden keeping his word. Absolutely. That's something that I know my community, we struggle with a lot, being promised certain things, and then for the good of whatever, we have to circumvent that. But I really want to commend President Biden for keeping his word in this issue.
Well, I am both simultaneously looking forward to and not looking forward to Judge Jackson's hearings, and hope that this goes smoothly and goes well and doesn't bring up all the foolishness that we're so used to seeing when these things happen. But Linda, speaking of systemic racism, stop me if you've heard this one before. It's been a rough couple of weeks. Of course, Ukraine was invaded by Russia. And in the midst of all the horror and tragedy and violence and death and separation and refugees and everything that has come along with that, because one person, truly one person in this world wanted a war in Ukraine and happened to have control of an army to do it. We've also seen just gross systemic racism on display in journalism. With reporters wondering how this could happen when the refugees are blonde-haired and blue-eyed, actual quote, talking about how this is different because this is in a civilized country, as though Syria and Iraq, which sit at the cradle of civilization, were not civilized countries. And then watching Africans be turned away at train stations who are trying to get out of the country because, there are people of color everywhere.
Right.
It's been horrifying. And, there is so much to wrap your mind around in what's happening in Ukraine and just the despair that comes from that. But I don't want to say I hope, but I want. And I want inflection. And there has been some good inflection online, particularly among the journalism community, around how these musings are even possible. But, those musings are at the very tip of the spear of this systemic racism, right? There are all these editorial choices in journalism that led to that one musing, right? The impact, the emphasis, the focus that is put on Europe or white people or people with blonde hair and blue eyes. And I can't speak to the underpinnings of Ukrainian society, so I can't say what happens at the train station and how African people are turned away. But I want inflection to take place around this, around who we deem worthy of refugee status and who we don't, who we call civilized and who we don't, and maybe stop to think about those choices a little bit more.
I totally agree with you. One of the things that I've been seeing and that I find very encouraging, for lack of a better word, is that even people, my people, when we talk about unity, there has always been this disconnect. And maybe it has been pushed for a greater cause to separate African Americans from Native African people of that continent, in that we are perceived as a different
Yeah.
culture, that
Yeah.
we are perceived as a different race of people. Oh, you're living in America, or you're from Africa. I'm not an African. Go back to Africa. I was born here in America.
Yep.
But we have been shown so many different times, and this is what surprises me, is that Africans, people of African descent, have lived in other cultures and European cultures. And it has
Absolutely.
been perceived to see that, oh, it's a little bit more freedom there. They're not as racist as the American white, and some of the American white, or the history therein. But this is on display for us now to see that it is simply because of the melanation in your skin. Doesn't have anything to do with whether or not you're a Kenyan medical student or an engineer,
Nope.
or if you had been a Black single mother from Chicago
Yep.
in Ukraine during that time. They would have simply seen the color of your skin and denied you the opportunity to leave a place that is being ravished by bombs and war at that particular time. And I think that what it has allowed for us to do is to recognize our humanity across the board together, our unity of humanity and oppression and the way that we are perceived. To your extent of the journalism and the way that it is being portrayed in the media, what I hope is happening, and this comes from a very spiritual place, is that God is allowing for you to see this in real time.
Yeah.
You can't turn away. This is not somebody telling you something and then you have the benefit of saying, well, maybe it didn't happen that way, and still hang on to that, that little piece of whatever that is. But it is an opportunity, like you said, for that inflection to say, how do I live in this civilization with people of different races? How am I to conduct myself, and what am I to allow? How am I to allow our society to proceed and to act in this? You can't deny it now. So it's like, choose. There's a cut and dry. There's no gray in that to me. So yeah, I've heard that many times before, Dave. But you know what?
I know.
Until everyone else has heard it, we're going to keep talking about it.
Our guest this episode is Bianca Tylek, who, if you are active on Twitter, you have heard a lot from lately. She's a Harvard-trained attorney who left a lucrative life in the financial services industry to start Worth Rises in New York. Their stated goal is to dismantle the prison industry and to end the exploitation of those it targets. And recently, she started a campaign on Twitter called #Prison, Linda, which of course also educated us on what the term #tag means, which we're going to learn about.
So I would say to you that it is such an honor, really, to meet you and to share space with you right now, because what you do is empowering for what I do. How do I circumvent this system? How do I crash it and bring it down when it, and I was thinking about it this morning. So I'm using two words. The people that it benefits are different from the people that profit from it. Does that make sense what I'm saying? And so when I'm dealing with everyday people in my community, as I'm trying to do reform and actually close this facility down, I'm dealing with people who benefit from it, right? But then the people who profit from it use the people that benefit from it as that shield of kind of separating us so that we don't see the commonalities in the fight. And I always knew it was about money. I actually call it Louisiana's coal mines, because people say Hillary Clinton really shot herself in the foot going to coal mine country, saying I'm going to close the coal mine down, without having first explained that I want to replace it with something that's not going to kill you. And so that's kind of what I see in my community, is that this is their coal mine. Rural areas that are mainly their economy is the prison, right? Everybody works there, or the ancillary spokes of it all. how do we put that in a form that is so plain for people to understand? And then the corporations that benefit from it are so far removed from the day-to-day people that are actually being targeted by it, that it's almost hard to make that connection until I found Worth Rises. And I just want to thank you for that. So I am just really honored to be here with you. And I want to thank you because the work that you do in real time is going to help grassroots organizations, like myself and like so many, I'm sure, that have reached out to you to thank you, to really get down to the nuts and bolts, to be able to show people how this slavery system actually really works.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me, and also, for all your work. I think I just want to really reciprocate the honor, right, to be here, and to be sitting with you and to be having this conversation, and thank you for you sharing your story, which I know is painful and hard and difficult, and also critical to the work, right, that we uplift when we discuss these things, because I mean, you're right in every sense, right? One thing that you were just talking about, the curriculum that we put out at Worth Rises about the prison industry, and what we say is knowledge is power, right? We know that. We know that when you know something, it is
Mhm.
much, much, much easier to combat it and harder for others to put spokes in your wheel, right? When you have the information that you need to fight a powerful system. This system is one that feeds off of a lack of transparency, right? It feeds off of people who are unaware of how the system operates.
Exactly.
And that's what it relies on in many ways in order to not just cause the harm that it does, not just to prey on people, but to expand that predatory behavior. So, I say we can yell from the steps of every Capitol building in the country, but there are people in that Capitol building having meetings behind closed doors
Mhm.
who you don't see, who you don't hear, but who have a tremendous amount of influence and power that comes in the form of green paper, right?
Yeah.
And that's the part that we're trying to unpack in many ways, so that we're not selling our freedom in the way that bail requires us to. And
Mm.
that's what's really reprehensible about the system, is people will trade a lot to be free, because that's what we all want. So I think over and over we see this system just really attacking our communities in the most difficult ways. And sort of alluded or talked about how dependent certain communities are on prisons and jails for jobs, or other things that are related to the prison industry. And I like to refer to that as what we call human trafficking, right?
Mhm.
It's like notion that we will pick Black and brown bodies out of urban, in large part, communities and ship them up to rural communities for white jobs,
Yeah.
right? And that, I think you rightly paralleled it to the coal industry. It's like, we want to acknowledge that coal is bad and the way that prison is bad, but also understand that people need jobs, and all of these things. It's like, how do we find you better jobs? But regardless of whether we can or cannot find you better jobs, what we cannot do is be trafficking other people so that you have one.
Amen.
Yeah,
Amen. And
where the black and brown bodies become the economic inputs, right?
mhm.
And but not to mention, like, what it's often not talked about, and there's been study after study about it, which is that communities that latched on to the prison boom
Mhm.
for economic, their economic stability, actually today, over that time since the 80s, 90s to now, have seen slower economic growth in
Yeah.
communities that
Yes.
actually pursued other
Yeah.
ventures and other ways to boost their economy. So it's critical for folks to understand that prisons are sort of a band-aid to some kind of job crisis that is neither good for the economy of your community nor is it good for the mental health of your community, because correctional jobs are not good jobs.
Mm-mm.
So let's ask about one of those state capitals, because we just happen to have you here on a day where New York Governor Kathy Hochul has announced there are a number of really sad parallels, along with this. One, it's gotten no news attention yet. If you just look on the news coverage of her announcement, all you get is her gleaming, friendly press release at this point, and no actual, news articles that she wants to start contracting prison labor again in the state of New York, which in her terms sounds like a nice way to reduce recidivism and provide job training before people get out. However, what she leaves out is that maybe the state will garnish half of their wages, and that the reason states are allowed to do this is granted to them under the 13th Amendment, which otherwise abolished slavery. And just how do we, I know how we hold Kathy Hochul and people like this accountable, but how do we talk through that to people who say, oh, well, this seems okay?
Thank you so much for raising that. It's really sad to see what's happening in New York. And it's sad for so many reasons. I think you bring up one, which is the reality of the 13th Amendment has an exception clause in it. We recently did polling and found that roughly 88% of Americans do not know that the 13th exception, which is purported and celebrated for having abolished slavery, has an exception clause in that allows for this enslavement and involuntary servitude of people who have been convicted of a crime as punishment for that crime. We are leading work at the federal level behind the abolition amendment to end that exception, and encourage folks to visit www.endtheexception.com to actually tell their Congress members to do that. So that's where that starts, right? It starts with that exception in the 13th Amendment. And then you start really bleeding that down into the states and into other federal law. And so many states also include this exception in their state constitutions, and states that don't are silent on the issue, right? Which means that the 13th Amendment prevails, right? Yeah. And so unless you're explicit about the issue, in your state, it is legal for slavery and involuntary servitude to be used as criminal punishment. And so taking us to New York, this program that Governor Kathy Hochul is looking to introduce actually has its roots in federal law. It is not a new or unique program. It's a program that was actually started by federal law in 1979 under what was called the Prison Industries Enhancement Certification Program. Lovely name. Yes. The program basically allows, once again, for the contracting of prison labor to private sector, private vendors, private corporations. A practice that in large part, fell out of favor with convict leasing back in the 1920s. And so in New York, the Constitution, in fact, very explicitly states that private use of labor is unlawful. So in order for Governor Hochul to actually implement her new policy, which is just an extension of this federal law, often referred to as the PI program, and introducing that in New York would actually require a state constitutional amendment. That is quite a high bar to try to introduce private use of prison labor in your state, in a state that is, in many ways touted for being progressive and liberal. We are looking to reintroduce private use of labor. And so one thing that is, really critical in understanding that is that there is also a campaign that we helped launch a few years ago called 13th Forward that is currently led by Legal Aid Society, Color of Change, Night Clue, and Citizen Action, that has been fighting since its launch to end forced labor, to increase wages, to establish employment protections for people who are incarcerated, to do the things that we actually should be doing in 2022 to eradicate slavery and every vestige of slavery from our system. And so while advocates are pushing for those type of amendments to the state constitution and not getting traction with the governor's office. The governor is instead moving backwards and deciding, why don't we let private sector, private corporations have access to this prison labor, knowing that they can be forced into labor, knowing that they have no right to necessarily prevailing wages. And as you notice, even in her legislation, which does allow for prevailing wages, is frankly required by the federal law, would allow for 50% garnishment of wages, no employment protections. This is what she's willing to do. The good news is that in order to amend the state constitution in New York, it takes passage of legislation in 2 separate legislative sessions and a ballot initiative. That means in order for Governor Hochul to do this, it is a minimum of 2 to 3 years to have the state constitution actually amended, which means a number of things. It means that we have time. It means that we as New Yorkers have power, and that we should be exercising that power to ensure that we are actually working towards finally abolishing slavery once and for all, and not reinstituting the ugliest parts of our history.
You know, it's amazing how even in this day and age, we can see things plainly in our face and not even realize that they're going on. I've been to the state capitol in Louisiana, and you've got beautiful men and women there in orange jumpsuits who are working in the kitchens feeding the legislators as they're coming through. And I remember when one of our Black Lives Matter activists had come through for when Alton Sterling was murdered in Baton Rouge. And he was like, "You guys are okay with this? This looks like a plantation. This is exactly what this is, you know?" And we can definitely hold Angola in Louisiana as one of the major prison plantations, you know, in the world, not just the United States of America. And so dissecting this down, there were people, and I would tell them, you know, slavery has not truly been abolished. They're like, "What are you talking about?" And I was like, because of that clause. But I must be frank in saying that I was even unaware of the strides that have been made in some of the states that have actually amended their constitutions to take that out. And so the work has to be done. That education is paramount, Bianca. I mean, it is amazing how many of us are still in the dark about that and living, actually being targeted by these initiatives, you know?
And it's not just that they benefit from a lack of transparency, like Bianca points out. It's also a subject material that a lot of the public would frankly not like to know about that benefits them as well, right? And we have hashtag prison that we want to ask you about.
Yes.
And that makes me, disclaimer, I'm not a crypto bro, and we had to look that up and figure out how to say it. But you launched hashtag prison on Twitter, and you do that for the non-technologically savvy like me by using the $ instead of the what used to be the pound sign, but is now the hashtag sign. And you can search it with hashtag $prison. And you're showcasing and pulling back the curtain on people that are profiting off of human suffering. So how's it going? I think is a good way to start.
Absolutely. And like you, cash tags was not something I was very familiar with before I started.
It's what the kids are talking about. It's what the kids are talking about.
Before I started hashtag prison, but it is sort of the perfect emblematic, I think, you know, label, right, that we can use for this industry. It puts what it puts first, dollars. And attaches them to prisons and caging and surveillance and everything that comes with it. So hashtag prison started honestly in an accident. So I was, every day I get these Google alerts. I have a whole bunch of things that I like to flag, to read about. And, every day I get my little group of Google alerts. And on that particular day, this was a few weeks ago, I had seen a number of companies and things going on that were just really infuriating. Banks that were helping underwrite loans for certain prison services companies, and you sort of name it, there was just like all flooded in my inbox. And I was like, I feel like people don't know this, right? Not that I know people don't know this, right? People do not know that the banks they bank with, the like, the companies that they're the executives that they like honor on their museum boards, or that are owners of their favorite like basketball teams and football teams, are engaged in this industry and preying on their communities. And so, I sort of quickly took to Twitter, as one does when they have something to say. No one to listen. No, I'm joking. So I and I posted, I said, look, like, it's time we talk about the prison industry. And if you're interested in learning about the prison industry and who's involved, and it's going to be deeper than, is McDonald's using or not using, right? Like, it's really about the core of this industry, an industry that has more than 4,000 corporations in it, right? Like, what does that look like? For everybody, Linda, who's not going to read the curriculum, right, and do the curriculum, I was like, here is one way to do a quick, like, everyday, your daily tidbit on what is the prison industry. And so, I encourage people to follow along. And I was really blown away by the response, right? The tweet sort of went viral, and, within 2 days, and over 60,000, likes and retweets and whatever else happens on Twitter. And then I realized I signed up for something I didn't need to sign up for.
As one does on Twitter.
Right? A daily thread of information, and, committing to news sources only, without having to go deep into the treasure boxes. I always tell people there's like plenty of things very active. You don't need to go that far into history to see really egregious corporate behavior. And I also think, things change over time. So I tell people all the time, don't repeat the things you've heard about brands you've heard about, because a lot of that information and data is outdated. But what we're doing with #prisons is really giving the right now. Like, who are the corporations? What are they doing? How are they impacting people's lives? How are they in many ways destroying and harming people's lives? So that people see not just the corporations, which is important, but even when a corporation isn't familiar to you, that you see the practice and you see the policies and you see the impact and you see the people, and you are enraged enough to do something, whether that's addressing that corporation, or that's addressing the policy that allows them to cause the harm that they do. The one thing that's also, and spurred by some of the original comments to my original tweet was the interest in actually what can we do. And so every day the thread ends with what can you do, and some kind of call to action, whether that's an action that is to change policy, signing a petition, calling your legislator, something like that, or it's simply an action to learn more. Because, you cannot go advocate until you know what you're talking about. And so many of the calls to action are to learn more, and even some sprinkled here and there are just to take care of ourselves.
Yeah, so that was going to be the bulk of
time on Twitter.
Yeah. Well, for those who are not tweeting, right? So the old heads who are like, tweet, what is that, baby, you talking about? It's so amazing to have this where you can go and not only retweet it, honey, but screenshot it. Look at me screenshotting, stuff, and being able to share it with people who can use it practically every day, right? People who say, how can I get involved? What can I do? I don't like that this is going on. But I think one of the examples that you did was like 3M. Nobody knew. I didn't even know the scope of 3M and all of the different products that they had, coming out, and that, prison labor was being responsible for. Now, because we get that old idea of just license plates, right? The prisoners in there, they're just like banging out license plates, right? But even with that being said, that is a job that they're not getting paid to do, that facility is benefiting from, that the state is benefiting from, and we need to hold them accountable, because there are people who are in society that need jobs that, could probably use a license plate factory, and not only that, but I know in my work, we're thinking you've got some people in here and they've got child support payments that they need to pay. When, I was talking to a young lady who had been formerly incarcerated, and she was talking about the fact that she had a balance. When she first got arrested, she went in with a balance because they drug tested her, and she's got to pay for that drug test. And by the time she got ready to get out, she had so much money that she owed that she couldn't even get money on her book. She was putting in somebody else's name because they were just taking it to go towards her balance, right? And so
Very
you've got
common.
these people waiting for, working for 86 cents an hour, I think you might have said, or
That's, yeah, that's generous. 86 cents a day is the
a
average.
day. Exactly. That's what it was. And if you're gonna do that, if they're gonna work, why can't it benefit society? Why can't it benefit their children, right? That's truly
Everyone.
pay.
I mean, at the end of the day, slavery can't get us right. Like
Mm-mm.
it just can't, right? Like there's no version of enslaving people. There's no version of the statement like they deserve it, right? There's no
Right.
like there's nothing that says this is how we make people whole. This
Come
is
on.
how we restore communities. This is how we heal trauma. This is how we rehabilitate people. This is how we treat substance abuse. Like
Yeah.
not none of those is the answer to slavery.
Right.
To none of us, right? And a society that continues to promote slavery cannot be one held in high esteem,
Mm-mm.
right? And that can't be proud of itself in that form, right? We have to say like we can't solve violence with violence, right? Like this is the type of thing that we're like trying to rebuff. And so we need to figure out how in 2022 to finally be able to say like no slavery, no exceptions. And the
Right.
fact that we're still having that conversation is really alarming, but critical. And I think, Linda, you bring up so many important issues regarding like how the economic instability of people who are inside affects their communities and their
Mm-hmm.
families on the outside, right?
Yeah.
That's really critical. I mean, many people are in prison because of economic instability, because of their, what they were doing to support their families, may or may not have been above bar. But taking that resource completely away from them and their families now leaves everyone in a hole, except for the state and others who are benefiting off their labor. And, just to close on the thought of the license plate, a lot of times what I try to do with both, hashtag prison and other of the like educational resources we put out at Worth Rises is to really get people to think a little bit below the surface, right? And think about the things that maybe they haven't. And so, for example, the question about license plates, sure, there's the conversation about who makes them and all of that. But then there's the question about like where does the metal come from?
Material
Where
come
does
from.
the
If
laminate come from? Where does the,
mm-hmm.
like that material? Because it doesn't just magically show up in the prison. It's there because somebody sold it to the prison
Mm-hmm.
knowing what it was going to be used for. And that's where 3M makes most of its money by not necessarily, even though it does use prison labor in one prison in Minnesota where it's headquartered, the majority of its role in prison labor is not even the explicit use of prison labor. It is the exploitation of that labor by serving correctional industries. And
Mm-hmm.
so really unpacking, what is a supply chain, not just down the supply chain, how does it get to us, but how does it, like, what's up the supply chain? Who are the suppliers, the manufacturers, before we even get to where does prison labor happen?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that secondary part is something I wanted to be sure to ask you about, and it is a sort of a deeper level of the surface. There are those sort of supply chain beneficiaries, right? And then there are all these sort of, I mean, you brought up banks as another one who are, providing loans. There are shareholders. I mean, it just seems disgusting to me that I would want to invest my money into a publicly traded company that's warehousing people or using humans as inputs. But there's defense attorneys who have contracts with sheriff's offices who's, can't keep their detainees alive. There are consultants who are, brought in to get paid exorbitant hourly rates to quote unquote fix the problems that are systemic in these
There are
institutions.
insurance companies.
There
Come
are
on now.
insurance companies. We could go.
Healthcare
So
companies.
give us,
Yeah.
take us. Linda and I are probably a lot more than casually familiar with some of these, but take the listeners on a tour of this next level, beyond the supply chain.
Absolutely. So oftentimes when you think about the prison industry, what we always hear, this is like the top three, and that's about as deep as it goes for lay people. And it's like the top one is private prisons. People are like, that's bad, even though most people have no concept of how, common or not common they are. People generally think, if we abolish private prisons, we have won. We have not won anything, frankly, but it's an important step. We should do it. Then the next thing you hear about is prison labor, and everybody wants to talk about prison labor and how Victoria's Secret once upon a time used prison labor. Sure, all that's true. It doesn't anymore. And also prison labor is important. We need to end slavery, all of these things. Also not the end of the road with what the prison industry is. Then you get some folks who might, if they have a direct experience, be familiar with prison telecom, let's say, or commissary, but basically these costs that are obviously borne in many cases by families. But again, that then being that last sort of level, and you kind of really have to have familiarity with the system to even know about that. But that's where it ends.
Yeah.
And that is still just the tip of the iceberg, right? That the reality is there are companies that fund, let's say, construction and architecture companies that fund do campaign financing behind sheriffs so that they can get the construction contract to replace a jail, right? There are, as we were saying, right, the insurance companies behind police associations and police departments that, help rebuff and fight families like yours, Linda, who lost a loved one, and negotiate how much, that settlement should be and insure against that, right? There are the muni bonds. There's the, what we call police brutality muni bonds in an organization called ACRE that's done incredible work around them, right? And who issues those muni bonds? Not just obviously the municipality, but the underwriters, the banks who are helping them put out bonds to pay for police brutality. There are companies like Aramark that provide food services inside prisons and jails and have been repeatedly and consistently sued for all types of violations, unconstitutional, cruel, and unusual punishment stemming from food that has rodent feces and body parts in it. And nevertheless continue to operate. There are the healthcare companies that leave pregnant women to literally give birth in jail cells alone, right? And need to be held accountable, right? The list of corporations that are engaged in the prison industry in one way or another is extensive. Sometimes it feels endless. But it is a list that we need to be prying into more aggressively every single day so that our economy is not based on caging of people. And so what we like to say at Worth Rises is we want to shut down the industry and shift the economy away from caging and control of human beings.
Yeah. And I mean, that's just so powerful. I mean, like you said, again, knowledge is powerful. And a lot of people can't think past the very superficial things that we think about, like you said, telecom and commissary, that are just right there in your face because it is so massive. And I tell you that, in this work that we do, trying to get people to actually buy into the vision of what public safety can mean without all of these layers, right? So now what do we shift to? Well, there are community-based organizations that are ready and willing to take up these causes outside of the mass incarceration system, right? And so I love what you say about not making it profitable to detain people, and I think that's one of the things about reimagining. We've got to give them the vision, but they can't see the vision if they don't know the truth behind what's driving the monster in the first place. I always tell them that when they're targeting my neighborhood, when they're targeting my child, I know they're feeding the beast. The beast has to be fed, right? And then they buy into our fears that people are going to jump through our windows and kill us in our sleep, when the reality is that the majority of the people that are being detained in these facilities are there for lifestyle things. You know what I'm saying? Poverty driven things, right? And so this information is just so powerful. And I thank you so much for not only revealing the problem, but then saying, look, this is what you can personally do to get involved. Educate yourself and then disassociate you. Let these people know we're not doing business with you, which then opens up the door for more entrepreneurship, because we got to have somebody to replace these sons of bitches. These sons of bitches that's profiting, right? Yeah.
Well, if I can add, 100%. I mean, so a lot of times, and I know you've heard this before, right? Like, don't do the crime if you can't do the time, right? And all this stuff. A lot of times what I want to tell people, because this is like a really important part of the like economic beast, right? As you call it, Linda, which is who decides what's a crime?
Come on.
Yeah.
And why did they decide that it was a crime?
Right. This isn't just about the consequences of like what is currently considered a crime, but it's about who gets to decide what a crime is. So why is marijuana legalization taken as long as it has? Because there were three critical lobbies: alcohol, pharmaceuticals, and private prisons, that lobbied against marijuana legalization for more than a decade, right? And why? Because those three stood to lose if marijuana was legalized. Right now, we're seeing a lot of corporations, particularly storefronts, right, looking at larceny and felony larceny rules, right, and asking for the enforcement and more tough on crime type policies around larceny, right, theft from their stores. So again, they're trying to influence what is a crime and what level of a crime it should be in order to protect either their businesses or to feed their businesses in one way or another, right? So really understanding that even what is our criminal law is fed by corporate interests that get to decide those things, and not by policies that feed our public safety, as you said, right? And my sort of favorite example that I often give is, ask yourself why, when you have insurance on your phone, right? Let's say your iPhone, your Android, whatever you got, you have insurance on your phone. And the idea is, if your phone gets lost or stolen, you'll be able to get a new phone. It's the number one thing you need in order to get that insurance to actually give you a new phone. You've been paying them for 2 years a monthly fee to give you your new phone. And when you lose it, or when you have it stolen, they want you to go to the cops. And they want you to get a letter from the police, a police report, you call it, to justify why they should give you what you've
been paying for. You better speak truth, girl.
Because you didn't trust me when I was paying that $10 every month.
That's right.
And the cops to validate me, that, like, our entire system is feeding corporations and financial institutions and greed every last way. And that is what the police literally back in the 1800s were set for: slave catching, protecting property, plantation owners, and all of that. And that's what they do today.
That's exactly right.
Are you sure you don't have like 40 more minutes for us just to tell you how wonderful we think your work is?
I'm just saying, girl. I'm just saying.
No,
I have
Mardi
totally
Gras.
forgotten about Mardi Gras. To hell with that. Let my people go. Set them free is what I'm talking about. In their minds, girl. You got to know when I go down to Mobile Mardi Gras, and this is full disclosure for all of our podcast listeners, I'm talking about what I've talked about today. I'm sorry, Dave. Did I date our podcast? You're going to
Nope. I'm not going to cut you off. You're on a roll. You're almost to 10. Linda's almost to 10. We're almost there. Linda's always worried I'm going to cut her off when she gets going. I'm like, this is the good stuff.
Excited to speak to you today. And I'm just thinking, oh my God, what an amazing woman you are. You know, what an amazing little force of nature that God has blessed us with in this earth to be able to help us with this Goliath, you know? And I just thank you so much for heeding that call. I am so sorry for what you had to go through that brought you to this place. Because I know you spoke about the murder of your boyfriend when you were, 15 years old. And I know the pain of losing someone close and how that is a daily thing. But it's a North Star as well, as my Lamar is for me and my family. And the work that you have done has moved us forward.
Thank you both so much. It's really been a pleasure talking to you both, and I'm so excited for the work, Linda, that you're doing and your podcast, both of you. So thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bianca Tylek is the founder and executive director of Worth Rises. We have a link to the organization and to her TED Talk, which tells the story about how she came to this work. You can find both of those links in the links we mentioned section of the Fair Fight Initiative podcast website. Our Fair Fight Initiative case update this week takes us to the Catahoula Correction Center in North Louisiana, where your crowdsourced donations have hired a team of attorneys to file suit on behalf of the family of Javon Kenderson. Javon was a 37-year-old man who died after a horrifying 20 days in that facility. Kenderson was serving a 20-year sentence when he was transferred to the for-profit CCC, which is operated by LaSalle Corrections, who we have spent a lot of time talking about on this program. They ran the facility where women were forced to have hysterectomies in ICE detention in Irwin County, Georgia. And they are also the people that are overseeing the exportation out of state of Houston's Harris County pretrial detainees, some 300 miles away to a for-profit facility in Louisiana, where they now have to sit and await trial. Well, when Javon Kenderson arrived at the Catahoula Corrections Center in November of 2020, he was in the midst of a psychotic episode. But LaSalle only contracts a mental health care employee 1 day a week. And that day of the week happened to be the day before he got there. So they made him wait 6 days to have a mental health appointment. Those 6 days are the beginnings of a horrifying combination of neglect and oversight, and frankly, just horror. The extent of LaSalle's care for him in that first week while he waited for his mental health appointment appears to be a few memos and a few phone calls between people that worked there in the Louisiana Department of Corrections, but no real action. And when he finally got to see that mental health care professional a week later, they diagnosed him with acute psychosis. So then you think something would change, right? It didn't. Nothing happened in the next week, according to the lawsuit that's now been filed in Louisiana, federal lawsuit. CCC staff watched him steal and smoke roach killer, and they didn't even make a record of it. By the time they took him for treatment after that, this is now 2 weeks after his arrival, he needed a wheelchair to be transported to the hospital. When he was finally seen by a doctor, they found severe head injuries on him that apparently had come from him banging his head against the cell door and had not been written up. The pictures of this are horrifying, and we can't share them with you. These are not bruises. Still, after that, they sent him back to the for-profit prison, despite suffering from the effects of smoking roach killer, which they saw him do, and massive wounds on his head. This is finally the point that they also called his mother, but couldn't connect with her. Their treatment for him after that for the next day was blankets and heat packs. Blankets and heat packs for acute psychosis and massive head wounds, and the respiratory effects of smoking roach killer. A day later, they had to take him back to the hospital, and he died 8 days after that. An autopsy says that it was the roach killer, which CCC staff saw him smoke that was listed as his cause of death. Linda, I have no words. This is not, as horrifying as this is not unique. And it keeps happening. And it keeps getting hidden or not recorded or not acted upon. And LaSalle keeps making money. And attorneys everywhere, through no fault of their own because of the way the system is set up, look at this and say, I can't make money from this.
Exactly. And that's the most insidious and horrifying thing as a mother, as a family member, or even the member of a community, when you see such neglect, when you see such blatant disregard for humanity, and you want someone to be held accountable for it. It's not just the settlement. It's not the money that's important.
Absolutely.
Because if we could highlight and bring these things to the forefront, if someone had to pay dearly for them, either by losing their freedom or the institution itself losing its accreditations or its ability to be able to run, this only comes through litigation. And this is why it is so dreadfully important that we continue to donate and to crowdsource, to send those donations in to the Fair Fight Initiative. And I'm speaking directly, to those people who, like me, have been through this, right? And it may not have turned out well for you, or for people who don't feel that the legal system could ever touch them in this way. Understand that when you're standing in this position, you feel absolutely powerless. And in order to get that power, you need someone who can navigate the system honestly, with integrity, and with the sole purpose of finding justice for you, what that looks like. And in this system, that is the attorneys, that are the people that are going to represent you. And so by crowdsourcing and making this resource available to families who could not bear the burden of the exhaustive investigations, the hiring of a expert to come in, prison. I mean, to get the depositions, just to even travel to get witness depositions and things like that, you would just be amazed at the expense of it all. And that ties the hands of attorneys who may otherwise be vigilant champions for your cause. So this is just, I'm just, taking some time to really make a direct appeal for the importance of why your crowdsource funds are really, really making a difference in not only the lives of the people who have been directly and indirectly affected, but in changing the system itself. Because when we can bring these cases to light, when we can litigate these cases, then we are exposing the cancer that is in our system, and that is the only way that we can heal it. So be a part of the healing of our nation.
And we're not raising this money to go after blood money. We're not going for the judgment. We're using this money to go up against by the hour defense attorneys paid for by a for-profit prison population who needs to learn that it can't be this way. We're going for their right to exist.
Yeah.
And the judgment that we're looking for is social change.
Yes. Yes.
You can find the donate button on the Fair Fight Initiative website. Of course, that is fairfightinitiative.org.
Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. said that. And despite the finite disappointment of the stories we share on the Fair Fight Initiative podcast, we maintain infinite hope that we can end it.
This week for Infinite Hope, we're going to leave the country because I think that there are lessons everywhere that we can take, just like talking about Ukraine to talk about systemic racism. There are lessons everywhere about what communities can do to break systems of control and systems of injustice. And so in a little point of personal privilege, I had the good fortune of enjoying some time off and took my boys to Bogota and Cartagena. And
Oh,
everybody looked at me like I was crazy. And we had an absolutely wonderful time. And don't let the stigma of what tore that country apart 30 years ago dissuade you from looking into traveling there yourself. But the highlight of the trip, I have to say, for both me and my 13-year-old, which stunned me, was a tour that we took of the Egipto barrio, which during that time in the 1990s was one of the most dangerous neighborhoods in all of Latin America. And it was ruled by the 10MA gang. And after 30 years of that and of a community in Colombia, which actually ranks its economic classes 1 through 6 and is deeply stratified, and there's still horrifying inequality, which led to huge protests last summer, and going into an election season this year, I fear will lead to more this year. They decided to pick it up from there. They decided something had to change. And they had a wonderful partner just down the hill from their barrio in the law school in Bogota, Colombia's best law school. Had frankly grown tired of petty theft and violence right up the hill from their campus. Mm-hmm. And the law school and this neighborhood, with the former gang members, founded Breaking Borders, which now employs formerly incarcerated people, former gang members, to serve as tour guides through their neighborhood, which has been revitalized through the experience. The graffiti is gone and replaced with murals from renowned artists all over Latin America. The neighborhood has its first street lights, which it has never had. They have a textile workshop where people are learning trades, and they've opened a preschool. And while the conditions in this neighborhood are still squalid, getting to interact with former gang members, Harold in particular, who was our tour guide, who had served 2 years in prison and was a former 10MA gang member, was a remarkable reminder that in the absence of schools that they couldn't attend because they couldn't afford uniforms, and hospitals, which didn't exist anywhere nearby, and a police barracks that had been abandoned in the 1990s by the National Police and never repopulated, that what enters that vacuum are new systems of control. And in these neighborhoods, of course, they were gangs. People are always going to seek to survive. Mm-hmm. And there are always ways that we can support a better life for everyone. And the lessons that I and my children learned while experiencing this, I think can be applicable and sometimes take you into a place that doesn't bring any preconceived notions with you. You know, if we had done the same thing in Detroit, I like to hope that I would have had the same mindset in how we can make things better. But sometimes maybe that's what it takes.
Yeah.
I don't know that anyone that listens to this is going to make it to Colombia anytime soon. But I would at least encourage you to look at the Breaking Borders page and see what it is they're doing. And think maybe is there something like that you could do in your community to break this cycle of injustice, to set aside your preconceived notions of why people are forced into a life of crime and help them do better. You can see the Breaking Borders tour. Fun fact, if you TripAdvisor at this point now, you can probably see some pictures of me and my kids. But we have a link to Breaking Borders on our website in the links we mentioned section, fairfightinitiative.org.
Another one done and done, Dave.
Another full plate.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's what we have to offer. We don't have to be surprised that we're going to have a full plate every time, and unfortunately,
I was going to say, I look forward to the day when the plate is empty for good reason.
I know, I was going to say. Unfortunately, there's a lot of, food for the fodder, right? But fortunately, we are being able to really, really have some amazing conversations with people who are game changers. And looking at this, I don't want to say from a new perspective, I say from the next perspective, right?
Yeah.
Because those that have come before us have been so vigilant and so courageous in leaving us these breadcrumbs that we can now go into the finances,
Yep.
deeply into, what is funding all of this madness and how this absolutely really works. I tell you, Bianca is, and I'll call her Bianca now, Miss
You guys are
Tylek.
friends. I mean, you're tight. I mean, at this point.
Is like I told her she's a rock star, right? I just love her tenacity and the way that she is going to really, really change people's perspective on just what is, what the funding is going on here, right? Yeah, it was just amazing to talk to her, and I learned so much. I do, and our guests are just enlightening me and empowering me in my walk here in Baton Rouge with the criminal justice reform that we're doing in Louisiana.
I don't think that's the last we're going to be hearing from Bianca Tylek.
I hope not. I don't think so. I know it's not the last that I'm going to talk to her. I just don't know if you guys will be privy to all of that.
The Fair Fight Initiative podcast is a production of the Fair Fight Initiative.
Founded in 2017, the Fair Fight Initiative is a 501c3 nonprofit organization dedicated to crowdsourcing litigation, which advocates for equal treatment under the law, confronts systemic injustice, and helps victims challenge abusers of power in court.
We believe justice crowdsourced is justice delivered.
By crowdsourcing resources from our contributors, we're able to finance the litigations no attorneys will take because of the overwhelming upfront cost to seek justice in our legal system.
And you can learn more about our mission and how to contribute by going to fairfightinitiative.org.